I will start with this. God created man in God's image and began tutoring him for God's likeness. I have a very deep uh, faith in that there's a difference between the image and the likeness. There's a difference between the image and likeness. When God said, let's create man in our image, according to our likeness, I believe that the likeness and the image is not the same. Some fathers of the church said they are, some said they are not. But if you really carefully study, the image and likeness is not exactly the same. And let me tell you a little bit. This was the plan for the humans as the children of God. When you have a child, and if you are a keen father, you want to bring that child to give that child the best of who you are, not the worst. You might hide from your child the evil stuff that you are not very proud of, but you want to show the child the best things that you have, so that they take that your best and build on it to become even better. In case of God, there is no better, but God wanted to tutor his child. But here's a problem. As any child, at certain age, maybe 13, 14, they start feeling, no, I want to stand on my own feet. Thank you, but no thank you. I want to find out who I am on my own. I don't want you. I don't want you to tell me what to do. I don't want you to tell me who you are. I don't care who you are. Right? So what would a good father or mother do? That's what God will do. It's a very difficult balance between giving your child the best you are and forcing the child to be like you. That delicate balance, we're going to see how God's going to do it, because he's the master in that. When Adam's family, that little children of God, distrusted God, they said, no, thank you, we don't want to be like you. We have a better choice. The serpent came and said, you can be better, you can do better, you don't need him. So they distrusted God in the garden and made a choice to abandon their father. They lost their life and place in God's family. That's the beginning of the story, chapter 3. They lost their place in the garden. They got out of God's life. All right? God did not abandon his lost children. We say this in the Basilian liturgy. He said, you have not abandoned us to the end, right? But went after them to renew the familial, the covenantal bonds, as much as humans could handle. He was gentle in approaching humans. He knew that he cannot force them because God respected our free will, big time. He created us to be like him. And the most important item in human character is free will. So he's not going to touch that. Mention his son in the New Testament. The covenants revealed God's desire to reunite his children to himself through the patriarchs, the prophets, and kings, and eventually through his son. Came in the proto-evangelion. Proto, the beginning, proto, initial. Evangelion, the first one, shall crush the head of the serpent. Means, I know, my children, that you've been deceived by the serpent. And simple. And the serpent tricked you. And I know what happened. So I promise, the seed is a single. And he will be handling this situation and conquering that serpent forever. This is called the first gospel. This is chapter 3, 3:15. That's how we think of the journey. There was a plan in God's mind, and the plan, it didn't go wrong because God knew from the beginning. It just had to be going through that direction, that his family has to go away from him, and he has to go after them, using their own free will. The Bible as a book. Now I'm going to move from here to the Bible as a book. After this introduction, we turn our attention to the Bible itself. The word Bible comes from the Greek biblios. Before that, I talked about history, what happened. Now I talk about the books as written. Books. You know, you look at books, you say, oh, well, they were made in 1992. The writer was so-and-so. It was edited by so-and-so, the publisher was so-and-so. 35 and 40 writers. There's not a single person who wrote the Bible. spanning 1500 years. Why I say that? Because the first one to write is Moses. And Moses is 1500 years before Christ. I want you to remember that. Just remember with me. It's a piece of information, keep it in mind. Abraham is 2000 years before Christ. Moses, 1500 years before Christ. How many years before Abraham and Moses? 500. David, 1000 years before Christ. How many years before Abraham, between Moses and David? And then Christ comes, and then let's say, talk about exile, 500 years before Christ. So you want to do 2000, Abraham. 1500, Moses. 1000, David. 500, exile and return. Again, 2000, Abraham. That's Middle Bronze Age. 1500, 1000, 500, exile. So between Moses and Jesus, in the time of Jesus, we had the New Testament writers like St. Matthew, Luke, Mark, John, James, Peter. So those writers written within 100 years from Christ. So how many years all the writers, starting from Moses, all the way to the New Testament? Around 1500 years, because this is when Moses started to write. Traditional Septuagint / Vulgate division. What's the Septuagint and the Vulgate? What's the Septuagint and the Vulgate? Now, I told you about this question earlier. Now, we move into something called Ancient Old Testament translations. Originally, the Bible language used the ancient Hebrew language. So all the Bible, the Old Testament, was written in Hebrew. Be careful now. Be careful, because they're going to explain to you. If you miss this, you're going to miss the whole point. This is a little bit of understanding of the ancient writings, ancient Hebrew, or the ancient Old Testament language. The exception to the books, all of them written in Hebrew. Exception is Daniel, some Daniel, Ezra, and Tobit. They were written in Aramaic. What's Aramaic? You hear this. Have you seen the Passion of the Christ? Anyone? What language Jesus used in that movie? Aramaic. What's Aramaic? It's ancient Syriac, the ancient language of Syria. What is Aramaic? It's the language, the common language used in Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers. Mesopotamia. So where did they get the Aramaic if it was the Hebrew? The Hebrew is the language of the Hebrew. The Hebrew should speak Hebrew. Why they had to speak Aramaic? Because a whole generation spent 70 years in exile. They left their land, were kicked out of it, and went to live in Iraq and Syria with the Babylonians, including the time of Daniel and Ezra. And Ezra was actually a scribe returning from the exile. So some of the books of the Bible, not too many, Daniel, Ezra, and Tobit. These are the three books that you would find Aramaic in. The rest of them is completely Hebrew. The Jewish communities that lived outside Judea used a Greek translation, thought to be made in Alexandria by 70 scholars. And for that, they named it the Septuagint. Septuagint means the book or the Bible of the 70. Septuagint means the 70 scribes. So you have Hebrew, and you have Aramaic, and now you have what? Greek. Keep that in mind, because I'm going to build on it. It's not going to stop here. So the Greek translation was made in Alexandria, that we know. But how was it made, and was it really 70 or not? We don't have details. This translation has been used by the apostles of Christ and the universal church since the first century, the Septuagint. If you go into, just focus with me. If you go into the New Testament and read the letters of St. Paul or the book of Acts, all the references they use for Old Testament is not coming from the Hebrew. It's coming from the Septuagint, the Greek. Okay? The universal church everywhere since the first century is using the Septuagint. Let me ask a question. If you open our catamaris for the Lent for the Lent, where we have the prophets, will you be reading the Septuagint or you will be reading the Hebrew? What do you think? A version of the Septuagint, we call it the Coptic version, but it's very much exactly the Septuagint. Is there a difference? Yes. There is a lot of differences between the Septuagint and the Hebrew, and I'll tell you why. One of them is in the books. There are more books in the Septuagint than the Hebrew, and then another one in the stories. For example, the story of David and Goliath is 30-some verses in the Hebrew. It is 50-some verses, and it's the opposite. 35 verses in the Septuagint, 50-some verses in the Hebrew. The Hebrew have much more. Why? I'm going to explain that in a second. Why there is a difference between each. I thought the Bible should be one thing. Either Greek or Hebrew should be one thing. Why we have differences in the stories and sometimes in the meaning. I told you about this before. We praise God in all his saints. That is Septuagint. Praise God in his holy place is the Hebrew. I'm going to give it a name right now. I'm going to call it the Masoretic. We'll talk about that in a second or two. So the church used, since the New Testament, actually, the writers of the New Testament used the Septuagint, not the Hebrew. When the Jews were exiled to Babylon by 605 BC, they had to learn Aramaic, the ancient language of Mesopotamia. When they returned from exile after 70 years, their main language was Aramaic. They needed a translation of the Bible that a common Aramaic person would understand. Like here, all our books were written in Arabic and Coptic. What did we have to do for you to understand what we're doing? Into English. And we have two Mangalayas. One we read the Arabic, and the other one we read the English. And the Jews had to do the same. When they came back from Syria, and they come back to their land in 500 BC, they had to read the Bible in their own language that they are now using, the Aramaic. They needed a translation of the Bible that a common Aramaic person would understand. In the synagogues, they kept a Hebrew copy. This is important, like we keep a Coptic copy. And also an Aramaic copy. They called it the Targum. This sounds like Arabic, right? Targum is to targum, to translate, the translation. So they used to read it in Hebrew as a prayer because they understood when the prophets wrote it, they wrote it in Hebrew. This was the language that the prophets spoke and the inspiration came in. They felt they should not abandon it, but nobody understood it. So what did they do? They made a translation into Targum, Aramaic Targum. Should we think of the Hebrew version as more accurate? Not necessarily, really. I'll tell you why. So we have Hebrew, we have Targum, and we have Septuagint. You got that? Everybody with me on this one? The Hebrew is the original language that's written. Targum is what they needed to translate into for people coming from the exile to understand. And the Septuagint is Jewish people living outside Judea who had been already established as communities 300 years before Christ have been using that Septuagint. Is the Hebrew, and this is what the Protestant world is trying to tell the Orthodox Church and the Catholic Church, you should go back to the Hebrew because the Hebrew is the original. Hebrew should be more correct than the Septuagint. Is that true? You know, when you hear it for the first time, when I heard it, I said, yeah. Why should I do the Septuagint if the Hebrew is the original language? But the apostles had used the Septuagint. And I'm going to try to see how we're going to reconcile this. We in the churches are using the Septuagint. Okay? Listen to this. This is very important now. Where is the Hebrew? Everybody will tell you, it's New King James. New King James. RSV. NIV. All these are Hebrew. Wait before you say that. Should we think of the Hebrew version as more accurate? Not necessarily, since the Hebrew manuscripts used in the different synagogues had variations and needed unification. They were not the same. Each synagogue had a different version because of the scribal error and whatever resources they had, they didn't have everything. So some synagogues have these books, some synagogues have these books. When you try to collect it, it might not be exactly the same. And needed unification. While the Septuagint was more standardized much earlier. Let me just tell you about when the Hebrew was standardized. When the scribes, and they did a monumental work to make the book that you have today in your hand. It's monumental. I cannot explain to you how much work was done to make the Bible you have now. But when was it done? When did the New King James Version, the Hebrew origin of it, put together? It's done by a people called the Masoretic scribes. When? It's actually started the 6th century AD. What do I mean by the 6th century AD? 600 years after Christ. I'm talking about Old Testament. Why did they did this? Because they looked around and saw the churches now are flourishing, Christians are turning, and using their own Bible, the Bible of the Hebrew, to teach about Christ. Said, that's nonsense. We have to stop this, and we have to make a version that is the Hebrew version, that belongs to the Jews, and will convince everybody to use it, not to use the Septuagint, whom the Christians are using. So 6th century AD, they started to compile and bring all the manuscripts, and they finished the work, took them 500 years, 400 to 500 years. It finished at 10th century AD by scholars at Talmudic academias in Babylonia and Palestine in an effort to reproduce as far as possible the original text of the Hebrew Old Testament. They did unify, but you would see certain things. In the Bibles, you have stories repeat, verses repeat, things repeat. Why? We didn't want to omit anything. They brought all of the things. If there's a little difference, they will keep the two pieces together. So does that resolve my question about which one to use? I think the Septuagint has been reconciled 300 years before Christ. The final thing, Dead Sea Scrolls, there was a big discovery in the 20th century. They found pottery, big pots in caves around the Dead Sea. And in those caves, they found the scrolls of the Bible, whole books. So we guess this was the community, that the monks that lived there, who scribed the Bible and put it together. Do you think they found the Hebrew or they found the Septuagint in those potteries? That these communities date back to 200, 300 years before Christ. Which Bible these communities used? They used both. They actually used both. They have versions of the Septuagint and they have versions of the Hebrew. So this does not really resolve the issue of which one is more accurate. But I'm going to tell you, the Masoretic is much more newer effort than the Septuagint. That's why I think you should not be feeling bad that the churches are all using it, since Christ have been using it, and the apostles, and the fathers of the church, and we are using it today. The Septuagint is as good and even better in some aspects than the Masoretic. Why we call it Masoretic? Because it's done by the Masoretic or the Masorite scribes. Why they call them Masorites? They have a Masura. You know what a Masura is? What's a Masura? A measuring tape. A Masura is a measuring tape. And why they call it Masura? Because they wanted to make sure that all the words are counted and the letters are counted. They are the one to start working on the indexing of the Bible. They did a huge, that's why I said, in a monumental effort to collect and keep the Bible. These scholars were named Masoretic as they used a Masura, a measuring system, the collection of information and comment on the text of the traditional Hebrew Bible by the Masorites. The Masoretic Bible is divided into three parts. When you talk about Hebrew now, the division of the Hebrew Bible, tripartite. You hear about it in the book, in the book of St. Luke, when Jesus explained to them what is pertaining to him in Torah, the law, in the prophets, and in the books. These are the three parts. Torah, Navayim, prophets, and Ketuvim. Torah is the books of Moses 5. Navayim is history plus prophets, former and later. And then books include Psalms, Proverbs, Chronic, Ecclesiasticus, Song of Songs, all these books. Even Esther and Ruth is part of these books. Chronicles is part of the books, not actually part of the history or the Navaim. So there's tripartite in the Hebrew, the Masoretic. While the Septuagint divides into Torah, history, prophets, and poetry and wisdom. We talked about